Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be finishing up the Great Northern War by Kings and Generals. This is the end of the Swedish Empire, Battle Gangut 1714. That's the subtitle for this particular episode. So we'll be finishing up this series and we'll be going into oversimplified Cold War starting tomorrow. With that said, thank you to everybody who had joined me this past week. This past week has seen my size of my channel double. I'm really appreciative to everybody who had joined the channel over the past few weeks. We're about a month old now, not quite there, but we're getting there. And I really didn't have a lot of hopes for this. I did this initially primarily because I eventually want to do original history videos, but I know that I've got a lot to learn about the technology, about how to do presentations, both from me speaking to you guys, as well as all the editing and all the other stuff that goes into this. So I figured the best way to learn is to do it. So I started a gaming channel. That's more just for me to learn with. I really don't expect a lot of people to go over there, and that's fine. That's great. At least I'll have it there for 20 years from now where I can watch myself and laugh at my idiocy. And then I did this reaction channel here because I just love the past, any aspects of the past, archaeology, paleontology, historical geology, but also history. I've got a degree in history. I love it, but it's a learning experience for me. And I really appreciate the people who have been joining me on this journey. I can't thank all of you enough. So with that said, as always, I will put a link to Kings and Generals' original video in the description below. I really encourage people to head over there and show Kings and Generals support because they put a lot of work in these videos. What they do is amazing. If I ever get my personal channel up for original videos, I hope I can do a fifth as well as they do. Actually, that's being generous. I hope I can do a 50th as well as they do. I would be very happy for that. Anyway, enough about that. Let's just go ahead and get into this, and let's figure out how this whole thing ends, with the disclaimer that I am not a military historian. This is very much a military series, so how much I can add is up to debate in this series, because Kings and Generals just do such a great job at getting all the details. There's just not much I can add except maybe some big picture stuff or random bits of trivia, especially on the Russian issues. Anyway, let's just continue and get through this and get ready for whatever comes next. Thanks again. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Onward. I embarrassed myself.
The Great Northern War is a conflict famous for its epic, monumental battles with exciting tactics and charismatic commanders. In contrast, the final phase of the war was a grueling slog between an empire that refused to let go of its golden age and an empire anxious to enter the global stage. Would the stubborn soldier king conjure up another miracle and save his country? Or would his obsession with winning ultimately lead to Sweden's and his own demise? Luckily, your own rise to glory is easier to achieve thanks to the sponsor of this video, manscaped.com.
Alright, we'll be skipping the advertisement since this is an older video. I say this every time, but if it's a recent video, I'll play the advertisements. If it's something more than a few months old, then I generally won't. And we're back.
With Sweden's final great continental army neutralized, Peter I of Russia was finally able to retire to his new capital and enjoy his favorite pastime, the navy. The commander of the Russian...
That can't be overemphasized enough. Peter the Great, from a very early age, was obsessed with the navy. There's a lot of stories about how that interest developed. I'm sure a lot of them are apocryphal. In other words, just cute anecdotes that were later. Kind of like here in America, we have stories like George Washington was honest. He couldn't lie. He had to admit that he chopped down the cherry tree. I think some of that is apocryphal with Peter the Great or any great figure. But yes, he loved the Navy from a very early age. He loved the military as well. He was known to have his friends help him simulate war games and battles. Later, he discovered the joys of the Navy, He discovered ships. He had his own ships built. He travels to Europe to learn how to build them himself. He studies personally with some of the finest shipbuilders in Europe. It's one of his many obsessions. He is one of those guys who's kind of all over the place, but if he has an obsession, a single obsession, it's probably going to be the Navy. He just loves all things naval.
Army in Germany, Menshikov had no time to celebrate after his victory. He besieged Sweden's 3 strongholds once again, and extorted a large sum of money from the city of Hamburg as punishment for aiding the Swedes. The Tsar would use that money to purchase several state-of-the-art ships from the Dutch. Even though he was winning on all fronts, Peter wished to make peace as soon as possible. Continuous wars had a devastating effect on Russia, and the threat of a new war with the Ottomans was looming. To his joy, however, Charles had been arrested by the Sultan for conspiracy, and Crimean raids were becoming increasingly rare. This allowed him to focus on Sweden's final frontier, Finland. With new troops and resources, Admiral Apraksin was able to swiftly advance into southern Finland.
He's not just interested in taking down Sweden. Again, he is very proud of Petersburg. He wants as much cushioning between himself and any potential rivals as he can get, because for him, that's the new capital. It's already, in his mind, it is. So he doesn't want the Swedes right on his border. He doesn't want them controlling this section of the Baltic, or this section for that matter. He's going to be doing everything he can to get as much between St. Petersburg and any potential rivals as he can get.
The new Russian navy played a pivotal role during the Finnish campaign, as supply shortages were the main cause of Russian failures there after the capture of Viborg. Peter refused to risk the expensive Dutch ships of the line for such operations, instead opting to use the much larger and easily replaceable galley fleet. By transporting his men behind the Swedish army, Peter was able to force General Liebecker to retreat several times, until he was finally replaced by a more capable commander. On the 8th of May 1713, a large Russian army was able to land near Helsinki. The Swedes, now under the command of Armfeldt, managed to defend the city for some time. In the end, the size of the Russian army proved to be too much for the small Swedish force, and Armfeldt ordered a retreat to Porvoo, though not before burning Helsinki and all of its supplies. In September, the Russian army captured Turku, thereby securing the entire southern coast of Finland.
Yep, and now he got better access to the Baltic.
One of Sweden's strongholds in Pomerania, Stettin, fell as well. The city was immediately given to the Prussians, who did not have to fire a single bullet in the conflict. Stralsund and Wismar still held strong, however the Allied noose was tightening around them. At this point, the Swedish government in Stockholm did not view Finland as an important theatre in the war. Therefore, very little was done to combat the Russian fleet's dominance in the area, and Armfeldt had to rely only on local recruits for his small army. After the fall of Turku, Armfeldt placed his army in a defensive position near the next great Finnish city on the Russian warpath. In October, he faced a 5 times larger Russian army at the Battle of Pelikkene. Although the Finnish army was defeated and lost most of its artillery, they managed to retreat with minimal casualties. The two armies met once again at Napue in February 1714. This time around, the Finnish army was decisively defeated. Armfeldt retreated with the remnants of his army to Sweden proper, leaving Finland at the mercy of the Russian occupier. Peter had absolutely no ambition of conquering Finland, and viewed it merely as a bargaining chip to be used to strengthen his position at the negotiating table once the Swedes were actually willing to negotiate. Until then, the land would be thoroughly ravaged in what became known as the Greater Wrath or the Great Hatred. Until the end of the war, Russian soldiers would commit innumerable atrocities in Finland. Looting, rape, torture and murder were widespread, and a large number of Finns were forced to move inland. The Finns also engaged in guerrilla warfare, prompting further retaliation from the Russians. Thousands of men were taken as slaves to St. Petersburg to be used as forced labor in Peter's dockyards or on his many architectural projects. Many children were taken from their homes as well to be used as future soldiers and sailors. The plague had also struck Finland during the occupation, further devastating the area. As in Finland the Russians were at Sweden's doorstep, the ruling council finally decided to ramp up their efforts in the eastern Baltic. A strong Swedish navy under Admiral Vatrang was finally sent to Finland. With their navy unable to enter the Gulf of Bothnia, Russian troops in the areas north of Turku began suffering from supply shortages. The land-based supply routes were slow and insecure, forcing the Russians to divert further resources to the area, resources that Peter would have wanted to use elsewhere. In spring, the Russians finally decided to try to sail by the coast of western Finland. However, a small Swedish force sank most of their ships. In May, Vatrang sailed towards Revel to see if he could capture the city. Upon seeing the improved coastal batteries in the area and several Russian ships of the line moored in the port, he decided that it would be foolish to attempt any kind of assault on the city. Meanwhile, Apraxin sailed from Kronstadt with a large fleet, hoping to tempt Vatrang into a naval encounter in the shallow coastal seas. The two navies met near Cape Hanko on the 29th of June.
Excuse me, I had to pause there, coughing a little bit. Don't want to blow your eardrums out.
Although numerically superior, the Russians had far weaker ships than their Swedish counterparts, and their sailors were less experienced. Knowing that his galleys would be decimated in the open sea, Apraxin withdrew all of his ships east of the peninsula, where he awaited further reinforcements from Helsinki. He also informed Peter, who was in Revel, of the situation, and requested that he bring all of the Russian ships of the line with him. Peter joined Apraxin on the 20th of July. However, he deemed the odds too unfavorable to bring his new ships. Galleys had one specific advantage in shallow seas compared to ships of the line. They depended on rowing and could move even when there was no wind.
Yep.
As Golitsyn and his men were now suffering from severe supply troubles, it was imperative for the Russian fleet to reach Turku as soon as possible. Peter's initial idea was to transport the galleys over the Hanko Isthmus. This idea was abandoned after a few days as the task was time-consuming and the ships were severely damaged. Vatrang was unaware that the Russian plan had failed and sent a detachment of 10 ships under Rear Admiral Ehrenhold.
So it did work, just not in the way he intended.
To the north of the peninsula. The rest of the Swedish fleet sailed towards the Russian force. Unfortunately for Vatrang, the weather calmed down on the 26th, and his wind-dependent ships of the line could not move further than Hanko.
Yeah, that's one reason that galleys continue in many parts of the world up until this time. Because yes, these big sailing vessels, the ships of the line, have a lot of advantages, but they have some disadvantages too. The big one being dependence on the wind. If you get into a major lull period where there's no wind, you're kind of at the mercy of whoever happens to want to take you out. You're sitting ducks, quite literally.
Peter realized what kind of an opportunity had just presented itself, and he sent a vanguard of several ships to bypass Vatrang's fleet and engage Ehrenhold. Fearing that the rest of the Russian galleys would catch his ships in the shallow coastal waters, Vatrang sailed south, allowing the opposing forces to pass without any resistance. Ehrenhold, also unable to move, was caught by the large Russian fleet. Apraxin initially tried to convince him to surrender without a fight. Ehrenhold refused, telling the envoys, "The king did not give me command of these ships so that I would surrender them without a fight. The Tsar can expect nothing from me and my subordinates other than strong resistance." The Swedish
Gotta give
fleet
the Swedes that. They've got guts and a half. Maybe too much.
consisted of 1 pram, 6 galleys, and 2 skerry boats. The ships were arrayed in a semi-crescent in between 2 islands, with the pram in the center and 3 galleys on each side, while the skerry boats were placed behind the line and did not engage in the battle. Apraxin had 98 ships under him, mostly galleys and half-galleys. Only around a quarter of that number would actually engage in the battle. 11 ships in the center, 6 on each flank, and 4 small ones would later attack from behind. The battle started on the morning of the 27th with massive artillery barrages from both sides. The artillery duel was in no way decisive, with ships on both sides sustaining only minimal damage. The Swedish ships carried superior artillery compared to their Russian counterparts. Due to their numbers, the Russians would have won even during a prolonged artillery battle, though with far heavier casualties. With the smoke from the artillery providing cover, the Russian fleet advanced simultaneously towards the Swedish line. This had two effects. The Swedish boats would not be able to concentrate their fire as effectively, and the Russian ships would decisively outnumber the Swedish ones. All 11 ships in the Russian center were ordered to advance towards the Swedish pram, called Elephant. Not only was that ship of the line the biggest threat to the Russian fleet, but Peter also wanted to capture it for his own collection. As the Russian ships were approaching, the Russian
Of course he did. Of course he did.
soldiers and sailors fired at the Swedes with their rifles. The Swedes, who were already heavily outnumbered, could not even mount a proper defense due to relentless incoming fire. The Russian troops began boarding the Swedish ships, and fierce close-quarters combat ensued. The Swedes fought bravely. However, it was only a matter of time until Russian numbers overwhelmed them. To Arinhold's surprise, 4 Russian gunboats went through a narrow passage between the island on their left and the mainland. Those gunboats subsequently attacked the Swedish galleys on the left and captured or sank all of them. The Swedish galleys on the right fell one by one as well, with only the Elephant still resisting. After a fire broke out on the Elephant, Arinhold was captured and the ship was taken over by the Russians. In the end, the Swedish lost all of their ships and men, while the Russian casualties amounted to several hundred men. Though the battle had little to no effect on the Swedish navy, its implications were substantially foreboding. The Russians would now be able to launch devastating raids into Sweden, and the numerically inferior Swedish navy could do little to nothing about it. Indeed, the Åland archipelago was captured later that year, and Umeå was sacked. Vatrang retreated with his fleet to Sweden. However, his failing health prevented him from taking any initiative in the following years.
Look at how fast Russia's growing now. They've got all Finland pretty much secured. They've got a good chunk of the Baltic, or the Gulf of Finland is completely secured. And they've got a good chunk of the Baltic coast up to here. Sorry, my brain just froze up again. I do that sometimes. Yeah, they're really gaining ground substantially.
The Swedish defeat caused a sense of panic in Stockholm, and the nobility felt that now it would only be a matter of time before the Russians struck at the capital. Having no other alternative,
Yeah, except that that's not really something that the Russians really want to do, I don't think. They're just more interested, because Peter's already been trying to secure a peace. If that's what he got to do in order to get a peace, that's what he'll do. But he's not really interested in that. He got what he wanted.
the Swedish Council of State sent a letter to Charles, informing him that they would start negotiations towards an achievable peace with the coalition unless he returned as quickly as possible. With the Sultan's appetite for war diminished, Charles made an obvious choice. Charles was now determined to reach his homeland, and he rode through Europe at a tremendous speed. He reached Stralsund in November, only 2 weeks after leaving Istanbul. In the following months, Charles started looking for new allies against the coalition. Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia was willing to join the war on Sweden's side in exchange for having Stettin recognized as his own. This did not go well with Charles's no-inch lost doctrine, so he refused. Prussia would invade Sweden in 1715, the same year as Hanover did. In November 1715, a combined Danish-Saxon-Prussian army landed on the island of Rügen. Charles's attempt to stop their advance failed, and he was forced to return to Stralsund. The king's presence may have encouraged his men to continue their stalwart defense, yet the fall of the city was inevitable. With Stralsund surrounded on all sides, Charles left for Sweden on the 22nd of December, merely 2 days before the city fell. 15 years and 3 months after his departure, Charles was finally on the soil of his homeland. This left Sweden with only Wismar on the continent. However, the city fell in 1716 too. Bremen-Verden was partially occupied by Denmark and partially by Hanover. However, George I gained all of it after paying a substantial sum to the Danish king. In 1716, the Allied powers gathered their fleets in Copenhagen and planned a massive assault on the Swedish mainland, with Peter as its commander. Frederick IV of Denmark grew suspicious of Peter's Baltic ambitions, however, refusing to partake in any future actions. Frustrated at this lack of trust between allies, Peter called off the invasion. The loss of Sweden's last holdings on the continent gave both the people and the nobility hope that the war would finally end. Nevertheless, Charles was still determined to continue fighting. More war.
That guy just does not know when to quit. I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that he was thrust into war at such a young age, as a teenager, really all he's ever known his adult life. And a lot of his attitude here is petulant teenager. In all seriousness, though, he's always been aggressive. He's always been a go-getter. But he just does not seem to understand that it's over. He doesn't want to stop. And the writing's on the wall at this point. He's got the mainland pretty much united against him. He's lost so much territory. He's lost so many men. The Russians have grown significantly stronger over the course of this, that he just doesn't want to stop.
Meant more men and more money, yet Sweden was devastated. Half the farmland was not cultivated because there were no laborers. Fisheries were abandoned.
Yeah, and this is a common problem in war, especially extended wars. If you're sending all your young men off to fight, you're going to suffer back home. You're going to have a lot of these guys are going to be farmers, fishermen. This happens all the time. This is what helps lead to things like the Russian Revolution in the 20th century. Is Russia's sending all their young men off to die in World War I, and that's leaving nobody back home to do the farming, to do the fishing, to do the essential stuff that's needed to keep people happy and alive. The same thing's going to happen anytime you have an extended war like this, where you got a lot of men going into the meat grinder.
Trade was ruined by the blockade of the Allied fleets. The fact that Charles was able to continue the war in spite of all this seems like nothing short of a miracle. This was only possible due to the appearance of Yuri Heinrich von Goetz as Charles's advisor. His administrative skill allowed Charles to raise another army, though his brutal methods only caused further dissent within the kingdom. Goetz also used the distrust among the allies to strengthen Sweden's diplomatic position. By playing George I and Peter against each other, Charles received several relatively favourable separate peace offers. This would have allowed Charles to focus on recovering his Pomeranian possessions. Goetz continuously tried to convince Charles to accept peace with Russia, in what can only be described as a Sisyphean task. To his credit, he did manage to wear down the stubborn king to accept the loss of Karelia and Ingria.
Sisyphean task, that refers to Greek mythology, the story of Sisyphus in Hades. Whoops, sorry, wrong button. Sisyphus is famously, he has to roll the boulder up the hill to the top as part of his punishment, but every time he gets it up there, it just rolls down the other side, till he has to start it all over again. When you say you have a Sisyphean task, it may basically mean it's a uphill battle that you're never going to win. No matter how well you do, you're always going to have, it's always going to go wrong. You're always going to have to start over again. Basically impossible.
Charles invaded Norway in 1716 in order to knock Denmark out of the war. However, the campaign was slow and costly. Finally, it would all be for naught, as on the 30th of November 1718, Charles was shot in the head and killed while besieging Frederikshamn. Whether it was a bullet from the Norwegian defenders or from one of his own men is still a matter of intense debate, as both are distinct possibilities. The beleaguered Swedish army then returned to Sweden with their king's body. While crossing the Scandinavian mountains, thousands would die due to cold and starvation. The last hope of reviving the Swedish Empire died along with Charles. As Charles neither married nor sired any offspring, he was succeeded by his sister, Ulrika Eleonora. She decided to renounce her absolute powers, and a period of parliamentary rule in Sweden would ensue. With his protector now dead, Goetz was also imprisoned and executed. Ulrika Eleonora would abdicate in 1720 in favour of her husband, Frederick of Hesse, who held virtually no power. In late 1719 and early 1720, Sweden signed the Treaties of Stockholm with Hanover and Prussia. Sweden ceded Bremen-Verden to Hanover and Stettin to Prussia. In the summer of 1720, Sweden and Denmark signed the Treaty of Frederiksborg, according to which Sweden would regain Wismar and Stralsund, while also losing their exemption from the Sound toll and paying war reparations to Denmark. Denmark would also gain part of Holstein-Gottorp. Saxony, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Sweden did not sign any peace treaty. Instead, they renewed the Treaty of Oliva from 1660. The last few years of the war were fairly quiet. Russian raids around Stockholm and Umeå are the only few exceptions. Though they did not have a profound effect on the war, they made the Swedish Riksdag increase their efforts at achieving peace. The final peace treaty was made at Nystad on the 10th of September 1721. Russia would gain Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, parts of Karelia and Viborg, while Finland would be returned to Sweden, together with 2 million thalers in war reparations. Sweden was now reduced to merely a regional power, would be gripped by the conflict between the monarchy and the parliament, and revanchism against Russia would dominate its foreign affairs. Poland-Lithuania would lose all semblance of central authority. The once powerful Commonwealth would become a battleground for Europe's empires in the next century. Denmark would enter a period of stability, while Prussia, similarly to Russia, would continue its growth on the European stage. The power vacuum left by Sweden would be filled by the ever-growing Russian Empire, which would dominate European affairs in the coming centuries. The Great Northern War completely changed the balance of power in Europe. Not only that, but it also marks a turning point in European history. Wars would have a European rather than a regional nature, as an increasing number of countries would become involved in each other's affairs and conflicts.
Yep.
We are planning to talk about these wars in the future, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Yep.
Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members.
Alright, as always, I highly encourage folks to show Kings and Generals your support if you enjoyed this series. Masterfully done. I learned a lot. And I understood the war in a broad stroke, but I never really had ever gotten into the details, other than a few little things over on the Russian side. So I found it very useful, especially from the military standpoint, because that is, if there's any area of history that I would consider a weak point, it's military history, just because that's just not something that's been one of my primary interests. I love all of the past, including the military stuff, but if you put a tier list of the things I'm interested in, battles and exactly how they're fought and which units are where, tends to be down towards the bottom of that for me. Anyway, at the end of the Great Northern War. Tomorrow, as I said before, we'll be heading into oversimplified Cold War, and then we will see where we go from there. But that is the plan for the next couple of days, is the Cold War. I'm not sure what we're going to be doing next. I have a few videos ahead that I keep in reserve just for days when I don't have anything else ready, but I still have some requests that I'm working on, and a few other things that I want to tackle as well. So we'll see where this goes. But thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all in the future. Until then, thanks again for joining me. Bye-bye.